Hello, I'm Tony Power, founder and principal consultant of Just Culture Consulting based in Melbourne, Australia. And with me once again is Paul Stretton, one of the most innovative thinkers, I think, in the just culture space. In our last video, we talked about how problematic, indeed sometimes catastrophic, blame and fear can be in an organisation. And we said that there was an alternative, a just culture. So what do we mean by this? It's perhaps not as straightforward as it sounds. There are different ideas around about how we respond to failure, how we treat people, how we ensure our systems are fair, and all of that comes under this broad category of just culture. So in this video, we're going to introduce the ideas of the original, the traditional or classic approach to just culture. So Paul, where should we start?
Tony, let's start at the very beginning, shall we? And so we'll start with James Reason, who's a British safety scientist, and he was the person that advocated for this move towards a just culture. And at the time, trying to recognise the issues around blame that we looked at on the first video, obviously no blame cultures would be a natural counterpoint to that. And James Reason wanted to offer a distinct alternative because he didn't consider no blame to be a viable solution or a credible solution, partly because some actions would justly deserve some sort of response or sanction. And so the role of accountability, be clear what was acceptable and unacceptable, was one of the founding principles that James Reason wanted to talk about. And I think the accountability question on its own is so important that we'll unpack that on a separate video in the future at some point. But from that, if people were then treated fairly and consistently, they would trust the organizational systemic response to an adverse event or a mistake or whatever that might be. And if they were treated fairly and they trust in the system, then they would report the concerns, the incidents, the near misses, etc. And then from a leadership point of view, then we understand how the system's truly performing, and then we'll be able to learn and improve. So that's kind of like the wider argument that James Reason was trying to argue. And within that, then, there are elements of a systems thinking type of approach and recognizing or trying to establish what is an issue created by the system and what is an issue created by individuals. So we've got these grades of culpability that kind of begin to inform how we treat people fairly, I guess. And I'm aware that I've always really talked to organizations around just culture, particularly through that safety lens. But given your legal background, Tony, I'm interested on where these ideas sit from a specifically a justice perspective.
Yeah, for me, one of the really most important things around just culture is the fact that justice is a universal human value, and it finds expression in different ways across different cultures and groups. But ultimately, I think it's a case of, well, a just and fair workplace is a good thing in of itself. And would any of us want to be involved in an unjust workplace? And I think an unjust workplace ultimately is a recipe for a toxic culture. And so, quite apart from that universality of justice, there's this idea that just culture can bring improvements in not just the safety space, but also other kinds of risk management, whether that's legal, reputational, financial. You can see the Volkswagen example we talked about in the last video as an example of that. But also better improving work systems. So yes, safer work systems, but also producing higher quality, being more reliable, improving the customer experience, and creating a mindset that we're willing to make improvements to systems, to continuous improvement, to be creative and innovative as staff are more willing to take appropriate risks, knowing that they're going to be assessed fairly. And ultimately that then leads to increased employee well-being and to team performance. So from here, it's okay, well, what does just culture look like in practice? And perhaps we can go back to the Devon deviate case that we also discussed in the last video. So if you want to know what that case is all about, go back and watch that video. You get all the facts of that. But in the real world, she was terminated by the hospital that she worked for, and ultimately then the nursing board revoked her nursing license. But Paul, how might that scenario play out using a just culture approach?
Well, the first thing that I think is really important as well when we're looking at just culture and the implementation of just culture is too often, too readily, we get down to flowcharts and checklists and algorithms. And I think that's not necessarily appropriate or helpful. It's about the principles that we're trying to achieve is something that we want to spend more time on. Having said that, obviously there's lots of flowcharts and checklists to enable people to try and put those principles into action. And so if we use James Reason's classical flowcharts to explore these principles for droit de vort, first question is, were the actions as intended? Well, yes, clearly droit de vort intended to prescribe the medicine. Or were the consequences intended? Absolutely not. Droit de vort's a committed, compassionate person that was distraught at what happened. So we're not thinking about sabotage, malevolent criminal acts here. This then leads us to consideration around unauthorized substances. No evidence of that. Did she knowingly violate safe operation procedures? Yes. And at the hearing, Ms. Vort testified that the medication error was completely her fault because she didn't double check the medicine that she had administered. So she would recognize that she'd gone outside of the safe operation procedures. Next then, were the procedures available, intelligible and correct? Well, yes, they were available. There'll be very few organizations that isn't the case. Were they intelligible? Yes, people understood them. It's not straightforward. Were they correct is maybe more of a bone of contention. And so when Ms. Vort was testifying, she identified that in 2017, the hospital had updated their electronic health record system. And this was creating huge delays at the medication cabinets. And because of that, the organization had instructed the nurses to override that system to prevent the delays and get the medicines as needed. And this was confirmed as well by the state investigator subsequently. So that we know that was the situation at the time. And Ms. Vort testified that overriding was something we did as part of our practice every day. You couldn't get a bag of fluids for a patient without using an override function. So she recognized that she had been complacent and distracted and didn't do the double check as we identified. If we, though, in terms of our analysis, say, well, actually, look, if these procedures were correct and had they followed the procedures, we wouldn't have got to the outcome that we did, then we would not consider that to be a reckless violation and consequently some sort of coaching, corrective action, disciplinary may well be considered to be appropriate. If we say no, these procedures were not correct, then we get to a system-induced violation. So that's a quite important junction of our analysis. If we carry on, though, then substitution tests, I always find that's not particularly helpful language for people trying to pick up these ideas. So would someone else likely have done the similar kind of thing? Well, yes, we know that the overrides were commonplace. It wasn't just droit de vort. Everybody was doing it every day. So that then leads us to a history of unsafe acts for droit de vort. Whilst we recognise she was a committed, compassionate professional at work, there is a history of unsafe acts because, in her own words, that she was overriding that system daily. And that would then take us to a point of a blameless error, but with some sort of corrective training or counselling needed. And so I suppose, Tony, I'm interested in your initial thoughts of what do you think in terms of that analysis and where you get to or where you potentially get to and whether that would be an appropriate and better outcome to what we got to in the real world.
Yeah, and I think that critical question, that step around were the procedures correct, I think a big part of that will be of the analysis around what do we mean when we talk about the procedures? Do we mean what is officially written down? And if that's what we mean, well, then clearly Yvonne de Vort was not following those procedures. Or do we take a wider view of procedures and say, well, what was actually happening at the hospital on a day-to-day basis? What were the staff verbally instructed to do? And it's quite common in many organisations for there to be a difference between what's officially written down and what actually happens on a day-to-day basis. It also then, that question and where ultimately you arrive at the end of that just culture analysis is, do you start grappling with those issues around joint culpability and how much is the individual responsible, and how much is the organisation and the system responsible? Because on the one hand, Deronda Vaught herself said that she was not as careful as she knew she ought to have been. Having said that, the organisation has deliberately, possibly for good reason, has lowered a safety defence that they have in their systems to reduce risk by instructing the staff to do these overrides, but seemingly hasn't taken a further step to perhaps mitigate that gap in their defences that they have put in place. And it's wrestling with that those grades of culpability and where you where you land on that is perhaps going to dictate what kind of response you're going to give to Deronda. But ultimately, I would certainly argue that the result that you talked about around corrective blameless error, but with corrective counselling and training, would be a more just outcome given those circumstances and that a recognition of that joint culpability, but also a healthier result for the overall health of the system, that it doesn't lose a skilled worker in an industry that is commonly understaffed. It's highly unlikely that Deronda is likely to make that mistake again, given what's happened.
I think as well, Tony, which is why I think the principles are important, and not just to fixate too much on flow charts and checklists, is if we end up saying that Deronda is a reckless violation, then actually have we done the learning and the improvement that we need to, or have we really just scapegoated the person that was manifested of a weak and improper system? Whereas if we recognise it's a system-induced violation, then we can do the work of improving that whole process and about what's really going what's really going on. And too often what happens is in safety, after an adverse event, that hindsight of the outcome prejudices our analysis, and then it's very easy for us to say, well, in that situation, had that person followed the rules as written out here, it wouldn't have happened. So therefore, the issue is with the individual, without really doing the work around the context and, as you talk about, the wider expectations of this is the way we work around here, and why do these things make sense at the time, are the kind of questions that we need to maybe focus on a little bit more.
Yeah, so ultimately then, if we're looking at this just culture approach, it's looking at after an adverse event and asking, well, what's happened? How did the person deviate from what would normally occur? And then what would be a just way to respond given all those circumstances, particularly taking into account all those system influences that you were talking about a moment ago, and also at the top of the video. So with this classic model of just culture, certainly one of the big strengths of it is by having these algorithms, these flow charts, is that it's standardized and it's a way to build consistency. You're always using that same process, and so staff can have a good idea about what that process is going to look like, and you get the more consistent results. And there's that very strong emphasis on fairness and of really wrestling with those different grades of culpability, if done well, at least. Because obviously there are some weaknesses with this model as well. Paul, would you like to perhaps talk about some of those?
Yeah, I think that's the important bit, Tony, about done well. And so it's about implementation and understanding those principles, because otherwise, if your instinct is to essentially fixate on the worker and look at their responsibility and their deviations and violations, then it may well be that you end up with what still feels like it's still like people are being blamed, rather than it being a truly fair and consistent and transparent approach. And also maybe it doesn't allow us to look at other stakeholders that are involved potentially, and there are ways in which we can maybe bring that into our analysis as well, to make sure that more our approach is truly just. I'm aware, Tony, as well, though, that we are very capable of talking about these things for a lengthy period of time, and our plan is to try and keep these videos short. So I think in our next video, we're going to look at some different models that try and address some of these shortcomings of the classical approach, particularly then restorative just culture, which is an approach that has become increasingly popular in recent years, especially in my experience in healthcare. And so we'll have a look at that in more detail. But for now, firstly, Tony, thank you for your time, and everybody, thank you for joining us. If you liked this video, please share it and leave a comment. If there's anything you'd like to ask or something that will be included in future videos, then we'd love to hear from you. But for now, have a great day. Thank you very much. See you next time.